Hello and welcome to Neutron One. I'm Jack.
And I'm Stuart. Welcome to this deep dive on the producer series profile pack for Metallica's And Justice for All. Today we're going to go through all of the sounds that are in the pack and explain about how they're used, how they work, how you get the most from them, and generally go deep into all of the things that may not be immediately obvious with these packs when you buy one and open it up. So before we begin on the sounds, we're just going to talk a little bit about the producer series and what it is. It's a product that we have a great deal of pride in, I guess you could say. It's a labor of love where we're going and trying to recreate as faithfully as possible guitar sounds on iconic recordings. So this actually is a special one for me because it's the very first one that we did, and it was a kind of voyage of discovery. Really pleased with how it came out. I think you're going to hear some very familiar sounds today. If you're a fan of the album, you should certainly recognize some of these tones. We're going to do a little bit also about layering and recording and how the sounds were used on the album when it was made, just to give you some insights there as well. But before we begin, we'll talk about producer series and what it is and what it isn't, what goes into making the profiles, what they contain, just to give you a bit of context. So I'm going to bring up here for you a little diagram. And I guess the most obvious parallel that you will draw with these kind of things is amp profile packs, of which there are no shortage in the world. And I want to just kind of explain to you why this is different to what you would find in maybe a normal amp profile pack, what the sound contains in terms of what it's made up of. So we'll start looking at this diagram on the screen. And if we were talking about a standard kind of amp profile, you would expect it to contain the first line and maybe a little bit of the room as well, but not too much, because most guitar amp modeling products don't allow for a very long window of time to capture fully the ambience of the room. So that tends to be truncated if it's there. So maybe you get a bit of it, but it's not going to be particularly authentic. So we'll say for certain, any pedals that are on in front of the amp, sound of the amplifier itself, the sound of the speaker that it's plugged into, and the microphone that is being used to capture it are the typical components you'd find in a standard amp model. So because this premise is about recreating the sound that you hear on an album, not just the sound of the amplifier, we have to go a lot deeper into what's going on with that sound in order to get something that's authentic and recognizable at the end. So you'll notice that there are a lot of other things here, and this is not necessarily, the same every time, but these are examples. So starting from after the microphone, we've got the ambience in the room, which is really, really important to the character of the sound, particularly on older recordings. Ambience was used almost more than you would think. Let's say that. There's a lot of ambience on most recorded guitar. Some of it's intentional because it imparts a particular sound that they were going for on the recording. Some of it may be less intentional, and it's more due to the fact that back in the day, anything recorded probably before about 1992 and more or less up to the mid-90s, most of recorded guitar tones that you would find on albums were recorded at quite high volume. They were an amp in a room turned up loud, and that unavoidably is going to make some of the sound of the room enter the microphones, particularly if you have several microphones around that sound source. Some of the sound of the room is going to get in, either intentionally or not. I believe in the case of this album, it's intentional. There's actually quite a big ambient sound going on, and that really helps with a heavier sound to impart this sort of feeling of scale. To the human brain, ambience represents reality. If you have a loud sound in a space and no reverberation at all, then your brain is not going to interpret that as sounding loud, because it's just not what happens in reality. So I think that preserving some of the kind of big ambience that would happen when a sound is powerful and loud in a space was important to them getting this kind of really big sound. It's a very studio sound on this particular album, and that means an awful lot of the things that we're talking about here are going to be part of it. So this would have been recorded on tape. It was made in 1988 onto a multi-track tape machine. As a matter of course, doing that, you're going to want to compress the signal going in, even if it's very light and you can't necessarily hear it on the recording. You do that to preserve the signal to noise ratio on the tape machine. Tape is quite noisy, and by using a compressor to just set a threshold and allow you to cut off any loud peaks in the sound, it means that you can feed more signal to the tape, and then relatively the noise level will be lower. So that's probably a guaranteed safety measure. Matter of course that would have been done on every recording around, well, everything from certainly the sort of early 70s onwards. Mixing console or preamp, whatever your microphone is plugged into, I suppose, that was capturing the audio that was going to tape, will have a sound, and sometimes there may be basic EQ or filtering or other things like that on the preamp that would be used to tame a fierce sound that is then going on to tape. Not always used, but sometimes is, and you can definitely hear it when it is. And then the sound of the tape machine yourself, which is going to be relative to how much signal you're sending to it. Tape is a kind of analog compression, and it's very audible. If you know the sound of it, you can definitely tell when something's been recorded onto a tape machine. Certainly, we can guarantee that it was back in 1988. But even on newer recordings now, the sound of analog tape is desirable, and it is not uncommon for people to track onto a tape machine during the recording process and then dump that off, onto Pro Tools or some other digital mixing platform later to keep the sound, but then gain the convenience of the digital stuff. So in this case, definitely tape going on. So once you've done the recording process and it's on the tape, the sound then will come off the tape in order to be mixed into another mixing console input. More compression may be added at that time if the sound requires it. Not always, but often. EQ will be used in the case of these sounds. We could say that there was definitely an experimental lean on this album. A lot of EQ was used to create very unnatural sounds, nothing like what you would hear coming out of an amplifier, and certainly not any amplifier that was being made in 1988. Subsequently, maybe you could say, in fact, I would personally say that the sound they achieved on this album would have influenced the sound of amplifiers being made after it came out. It's a very iconic recording. There are, I guess, mixed views, a bit of a Marmite situation. Loads of people love the sound of this album and believe that it's a seminal piece of work. And there are others who maybe like the songs but don't like the sound. And you'll see those discussions going on daily in every forum in the land. But like it or not, there's no denying that it was influential and iconic for Metallica and definitely formative in terms of what they did after. Whether it sounded the same or not, it was a very big change from what they'd done before, and it led them on to what then became, I think, their kind of enduring signature sound. So carrying on through the signal chain here for the mix process, outboard EQ and outboard effects definitely played a part in this particular album's sound, because it's quite extreme in terms of the changes from the sound of the raw amplifier to what was then heard on the finished recording. And in order to achieve that, all manner of equalizers and outboard equipment were used to kind of wrangle a raw recognizable sound, a normal sound, I guess you could say, into something that was really quite different to anything that had been heard before. That would then have been, after the mix is finished, handed off to a mastering engineer who would have done final tweaks to make sure that nothing, first of all, would have made it difficult to press onto vinyl, because we're still in the vinyl era in 88. CD's around, but vinyl is too. So when they mastered it, they probably would have made sure that, the needle wasn't going to jump out of the groove on the record and that kind of stuff. And then the usual fine-tuning of EQ to make sure there's an even sound to the entire album, which then would have been put onto a master tape as well in 1988. Just about. There would have been digital mastering mediums by then, but I don't know. I'm not sure even by that point that it was mainstream. Probably a master tape still would have been used, an analog tape. So, a lot of things past the amplifier and the microphone, all of which, in this case particularly, have a huge impact on the sound you then hear on the record. I would say that multiple EQ units were used to create these sounds, as well as a lot of outboard. Probably it was very heavily crafted to the point where intentionally it sounded nothing like the original amp. And certainly, if you were to buy one of the amplifiers used on this album, which was the Mesa Boogie Mark II C+, and plug that in and sit in front of it and play, you are not going to hear the sound that comes out on this record. It's recognizably the core of the tone, but it's a long journey. And so this seemed like a great album to start the show for Producer Series, because it really does represent the impact that the studio process had between the raw sound and the finished record, and for us to be able to take that sound, make it recognizable as the sound on the record, represented the kind of litmus test for this process working, first of all, and also its validity and kind of, I don't know, the fun factor of being able to say, wow, that really nailed the sound, and how cool it is to then be able to play along to those tracks, or backing tracks, or whatever you want to do, using the exact sound that was on the record. It's good fun. It's really cool. So that's the premise of Producer Series. Hopefully that explains the basic idea of what we're trying to achieve, the sound on the record, not just the sound of the amplifier, and how much of a difference there can be in some cases between those two things. There are also, in the Producer Series makeup, 3 distinct types of profile, and I'll just quickly explain what those are as well, because it's useful to know in terms of how you can then utilize the things that are in the pack. So the first and most obvious type of profile we have is what's called an all-in-one. You'll see it labeled as AIO in the pack, and that is, as implies the name, all of the things. I mean, these things are examples, but everything that went into making up the sound, it's all of it in a single profile that you can just load up and play, and it will sound like the core tone on that record did. The second is what's called the DI profile, and that represents, if I draw a little line here after the speaker, everything to the left of that line. Sorry, no, my mistake.
To the right, yeah.
Everything to the left of this line, not including the speaker. So it's just the amplifier and any pedals or anything that are before it, and no speaker, no microphone, and none of the other things that make up the sound. The purpose for that is to kind of, I guess, mimic the situation for the artist. Quite often, you would find that an artist would assemble a rig to make an album with. They'd have, maybe a few choices, but a couple of kind of core amplifiers, maybe some ancillary pedals, other bits and pieces, but not the studio stuff. That's, very much for the recording process. But that rig that they assemble and the core of the sound that then was put into the studio recording process would be a rig that they would commonly then take out and use live on stage for the tour, for the album. They're not going to go and suddenly use a completely different amp. So in the case of that tour, that's exactly what happened. They retained the Mesa Boogie Mark II C+ for the main rhythm tones on the tour, and used roughly the same settings that were used on the album, but probably some kind of common middle ground that worked for the majority of the set, So that means you've got the core amp tone, and if you wanted to, you'd be able to run that into a guitar speaker and use it live. So either into the like a Class D power amp or something like that, straight into a speaker cabinet, or if you wanted to, maybe into the effects return of another amplifier head that could then amplify the cabinet for you. So you could get the core preamp and power amp tone and be able to use it with a real amplifier live in situ. For those people as well who are big fans of, and I know there are many, of the sort of sound, the amp in the room sound, how it sounds when you're just sat in front of it playing it. The DI gives you a window into that as well. If it's something that you really want to use and you want to hear, you get the other side of it from the studio. You get the real sound of what was being recorded. So it is very much, if you plug that into a speaker and you turn it up in the room, that's exactly what you're going to get, the amp sound in the room. So that's really the purpose of DI and why it's useful. It's something that we really wanted to include because it's a window on that the original source of the sound and shows you the journey that it's gone on to reach the final result. And then the third and final profile type is called production, and that if you remember, the DI is only the amp and whatever's in front of it, then the production is everything else. So the speaker, all the studio processing, everything that's going on. Not the effects; those are a separate preset that loads into Convolugy XT, and we have a video on that, which I would very much encourage you to watch if you're interested in the studio effects. When I mean effects, I say things like reverb and delay and chorus, that those kind of mix effects that would have been put on during the mixing process that aren't part of the kind of core tone. Those are in a separate preset. You do get them though; they are included in the producer series packs, and you can load those up as well, so you get the full experience of the sound on that song on the album, including all of the effects. And it's a compound preset, so it has everything in one. Not too many of those in this pack, as it happens, because the majority of the sounds are quite heavy, chuggy rhythm sounds, and tend to really only contain short ambience type reverbs that are actually all captured as part of the profiling process. So they're embedded in the all-in-one. As you can see, the room is part of that process. So it's really only for things like, the lead sounds, the solo sounds, and the clean sounds for something like One, where it's got chorus on it and it's got reverb and stuff going on, that those have a effects preset. So there's only a couple of those for this pack because they're the only sounds that on the album that actually have effects on, other than the room. But in other packs, you'll probably see quite a lot of those, maybe one even per sound. And that's just a really nice thing for us to be able to give, as well as the core tone, that of course you can't include in the amp profile anyway, but wouldn't want to, because it would reduce the usefulness of that sound dramatically to have everything baked into the profile with no separation. We really wanted to be able to kind of give you the exploded view of hearing just the amp, being able to use that as well in different scenarios, hearing just the speaker in the production. Again, that's really handy, because if you've got your own amplifier and you're running something like a power soak or whatever, or a DI output or another profile even, you can run that into the production profile and really get that kind of transported into that recording session's vibe and feel. And you get the room and all of the compression and EQ and all of the stylistic choices that were made as part of the creation of that sound imparted on your own amp that you can use in real time. So that's kind of a kind of fun thing, but also practically quite useful if you want to fast track to a sort of known good with an existing sound that you already have, or an amp that you already have. So that's it for those three. There's only one thing really before we begin, other than that I want to go over, and that's just the calibration of your levels. This is something that I'm going to go over, I think, in every single one of these deep dives, just because it really makes a big difference to your experience of the sounds. And I can maybe give you some examples of how that could be a big change if you don't have it done correctly. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to massively increase the amount of gain on this sound. And this is going to simulate the calibration being incorrect, being too loud. I'm going to play something now. Now, by no means a bad sound, right? It's cool. But you'll notice my peak level here is around -6. This is our golden zone, between -6 and -12. It's not super critical. You do want to make sure, though, that it doesn't go above -6. You're going to then lose your sort of safety net of not going into clipping. So anywhere between -6 and -12 on your input gain meters for the level of your guitar going into your sound card is going to work really well. I'm going to put this back to where it was. And you'll notice that some of these sounds I've tweaked specifically for the guitar that I'm using today, which, as you can see, is rather relevant to the Metallica story. And it's nice because it's kind of I know they didn't use it for every single track, but the combination of the EMG, the 8189 combo is something that's endured quite a long way through their career. So it gives us a really great reference point for these sounds to make sure that what we're feeding into them is common to what they would have been using, or at least indicative of something that they used a majority of the time. So this is an Epiphone 1984 EX, I think it's called. And it's a kind of homage to James Hetfield's Gibson Explorer that he was using right from the sort of end period of the Ride the Lightning album through to after on And Justice for All, and after that, before he had his endorsement deal with ESP and started playing what was basically an ESP version of the exact same guitar for many years. So this has a kind of core sound that we can trust when it comes to making sure that everything's behaving the way it should. And that's why we're using it to do the demonstration today. But I've put the input gain back down to get us back into where it should be. And you'll hear that it massively changes the sound because it's much tighter now, yeah? And having things in the correct kind of gain range for this sound particularly is quite important because it doesn't have as much gain as probably you might think. It's kind of a bit of a crunch to like heavy overdrive, certainly not like really, really distorted as maybe the perception of Metallica sound can be. There's a reason why that perception occurs, and it's mainly to do with the way that they record the sounds, which we'll go into actually in this video, and I'll explain later on. But the premise here is calibrate your level. And the reason I say that is you only have to really do this once. And then you're going to be good for all the profiles that we create. Everything that we do is working from this exact same principle that, our level when we create the sound is going to be between -6 and -12. That range is the sweet spot at which it'll sound to you like it did to us when we made it. So if that's something that you want, then you probably should do it. So just use the input gain control on your sound card, wherever you're plugging your guitar in, and strum away. You don't have to be extreme about hitting it really hard or anything. I just play normally and look for the peak. You can see here we've got a little peak that appears. So this is at the high end of that range, but we're dealing with active pickups here, and that's to be expected. It's going to be quite a loud output, but it's absolutely fine. So if you have an issue then when you need to adjust it any further, you can fine tune that with the input control on the plugin itself. This is just like a volume control going in, doesn't affect the sound. I've seen a lot of actually incorrect information about what this control does. This is not a gain control. It doesn't guess about changing the characteristics of the gain of anything. It literally is the amount of level going in. So in that respect, it's very safe to use this control. It's not going to change the sound. Same for the output on this as well. It doesn't change anything. It's just the amount of level coming out of the plugin. So feel free to use that to make fine adjustments if you think that you're going in too hot or you can't get enough signal in and you're not quite there. Just simply add however many decibels you're missing or take away however many you've got too many. And this is a decibel change, so it will be equivalent. We've talked, obviously, about the components that make up the sound. And there are many and varied, but there's another part to this story as well, which is equally important, and that is to do with how all of these individual things are set. Your amplifier, if it has multiple channels, maybe it has buttons, selectors, EQ on the amp, all kinds of things. They have to be set correctly. Otherwise, it doesn't really matter how accurately you're profiling it. The sound that you're starting with is going to have a very long journey to reach the sound at the end if it doesn't begin with at least a very similar starting point. Yeah. So that kind of goes through the entire chain. We've got a lot of devices, and each of them has to be analyzed and set correctly in order to replay its role in creating that sound that you hear on the album at the end.
And I think a really important thing as well, and I think everyone would have experienced it, when you get to the end normally and stuff just doesn't fit and you do that little tweak and the guitars are popping out and they're coming back, it's the understanding of that flow that's allowing that space and that sound to be in the space. Everyone must have associated with that pain of being so close
Well,
but then so far away.
in the case of recreating something, it's probably doubly hard because it's not what's right to your ear, it's what kind of makes sense
Yeah.
to the behavior. And I
What-
think that there's a lot to discuss about behavior, and that word is important because you can have a sound that will fool your ears that will sound similar
Yeah.
by just using a similar sound
Yeah, yeah,
and you know, a matching EQ or an impulse response that was created from maybe like an isolated track
Yeah.
from the original recording or something like that. And you know, it can get pretty close in terms of quickly you hear it and think, well, oh yeah, that sounds, you know, that sounds similar to me, but it's not going to behave in the same way. By that I mean when you start playing
Yeah.
different songs, different parts on that sound, it's not going to always give you back exactly the same thing that that original would have done, due to the effect of all of those different things being part of the changes that are happening. And you know, a good example actually on this particular record is this low end resonance in the sound that happens sometimes on certain notes when you're chugging really hard on them, which is, it's a kind of artifact of so much EQ being used. It's actually representative of what would happen if you were to try and cheat at this process and take a sound that was far away from the target and use only EQ to get it to sound the same. You get these kind of peaks in the sound where just sometimes one note will really stick out and be, you know, hyper resonant or whatever. Now that's actually for real on the actual album version of this sound. And so when you experience that playing it, it is authentic. It's there, and it's to do with the fact that they've used loads of EQ to get the sound from where it started to their vision of where it was going to end. The other interesting thing, I need to say the word interesting, maybe divisive thing about this album is the fact that it has very, very little audible bass guitar on it. And that was a decision that was made, well, for varying reasons. For who knows the real reason, but you know, there are theories that it was to do with a falling out in the band. There are others that were just that it was a stylistic choice, you know, but certainly it was intended for whatever reason. And the byproduct of there being very little bass guitar in the sound on the album is further enhances the need for quite a lot of low end on the guitar parts. And so that's how they've ended up with that really deep resonant low end going on. And it's certainly something that became a recognizable part of, you know, Metallica's sound journey. But yeah, so that the artifacting that you hear, the real low end resonance on certain notes on this album particularly, is a really good analogy for how a process like this would sound if you were to try and do it only with EQ, not matching all of the individual parts of the sound that can contribute to making it up. If you were to just take, like, you know, the same amp and try to EQ it to sound like the album, and do nothing else, you're going to end up with a sort of even more amplified version of that problem, which musically makes the sound very difficult to use in the context of recording, because you're constantly fighting with the thing sticking out, and then you EQ it, and then the sound isn't fat enough anymore because you've taken the low end away, and then, you know, put it back in again. Oh my god! So then you can maybe use a compressor or you know, a side chain or whatever to try and solve the problem. But the, you know, the basic principle there is that, you know, it's not the same thing to just use IRs or matching EQs or AI or anything else. The real answer to getting it to sound the same is matching as many of the elements that make up the sound as possible, and getting those set in as close to the same way as you can. And we had a fantastic advantage with this particular album, which was that the original recording engineer, Fleming Rasmussen, he kept notes from the sessions, and he actually personally released them online some time ago now. Bless his heart. Thank you, Fleming. It was a great help to getting, you know, in the ballpark so that we could then begin the process of fine-tuning this stuff. If only that was always the case. It certainly isn't, but very welcome in this case, and really contributed to how close we managed to get these sounds. So there we go. If you're a producer, take notes. You never know when you might need them. Okay, so let's move on. Let's start looking at the sounds. So the principle of choosing the profiles that we make for these packs is pretty simple. We can't. I mean, these programs take a very long time to make, and they're extremely complicated, as you know. You can probably see from the explanation of what goes into making them. So we can't profile every single sound on the album. It's not practical. It would take far too long, and definitely wouldn't necessarily be required when there's a lot of commonality going on with the sounds that are being used, and maybe they're just slightly different, but it's the same core on this track as that one. So instead we try to choose, and we use the number 5. It doesn't always work. Sometimes there are more. There's always at least 5 though, of the most distinct sounds that we can find on the album to give the most variety. And certainly if there's a case where I know through the research part of this process that it was a different amp or a different rig or a different device that was being used to create the sound on a particular song, and that's not the same one that was being used on the majority of the others, then that would be a flag. It's something that we definitely would want to make sure that we capture to give the most variety. Thankfully, there's not a huge amount of that variety on this album. We managed to pretty much cover every important base, but we're going to demo some of the sounds, and then after that, I'll also show you one of the sounds being used for a different song than it was profiled for. So you can see that it's not limited just to, you can only use that profile for that part on that song. As we explained, the artists, a lot of them had common rigs that they would use as the heart of the recording process for an album. So a lot of those core sounds are reusable, and maybe just with a little bit of adjustment of EQ on the NAMM plugin interface, you can take it from this song to that song, and it's totally it's totally good. So we'll show that too. There's another little thing that I want to go through as well, which is about the way that the sounds are layered and recorded, the kind of habits that went into the production that would lead you to maybe think the sound was heavier, more distorted than it actually is. It's being recorded multiple times, and I've got an example of that for one of the tracks that we're going to play you, which is built up in a similar way. Perhaps not as many layers as they would have had on this particular record. I think they were deep into that phase of experimenting with those kind of techniques at the time. It could have been a bit more extreme. Maybe there were more parts. I don't know. What I can hear though, definitely I've kind of recreated in this little excerpt that we'll show you, and you'll hear the individual parts as well and how I'll tell you how they're recorded and how it builds up the sound. And of course, I'll play in real time for you as well the actual core sound that is being used to create the layering. So first track is, I'm going to apologize now. I mean, I may make a mess of some of these riffs. I'll try my best to remember them. It's been quite a long time since I've played this album, I can tell you, and although I remember most of it, it's not probably an accurate memory in all cases. So apologies. That's the job for you guys to take this and go and do the fully note accurate versions of these. Right, so here we go. So Blackened. First track on the album, kind of first experience of their new sound approach when they released it, and it's cool. It's got a really thick, deep low end that works really well with this type of guitar because it's quite a focused low end from a big body, the active pickups as well. So if I play a bit of the riff. You get the idea? There we go. So that's the core sound. And that represents, I think, quite a lot of the rhythm playing on this album. That sound is being used all over the place. What's interesting, though, is there are a couple of other sounds. And where there's variation, you can hear quite often it's a combination of this with something else, or there's kind of 3 core tones. So let me play you another one. So this is from Dyers. Now, this is a completely different rig. The Dyers Eve sound is an ADA MP1. It's not the Mesa Boogie amp. We have an ADA one here, MP1 here. I don't know if you can see it in the shop, but trust me, that's what we used. I've had mine for a long time, and this album is one of the reasons why I own it. It's one of those things that you read when you're, ogling all the equipment of your idols, and I've seen that pop up on so many references to iconic recordings that I was a fan of. I eventually crumbled and went out and got one, and I love the thing. But really great to have it for this because it's kind of important. So it's being used for the rhythm sound on Dyers Eve. It's also used for all of the lead playing that I can hear, at least, that Kirk Hammett does on this album. Sometimes with a tube screamer, sometimes slightly blended with a Mesa Boogie as well, but it's very, very slight. The kind of main tone you're hearing from Kirk Hammett's lead work on this is definitely MP1. It's quite a recognizable sound. But on this track, it was used for the rhythm playing too. And if I remember correctly, the live rig that they built to tour this album did have some ADA MP1 units in James Hetfield's rig as well. So it's quite likely that it was being used sort of either interchangeably or blended with the amp for some of the layering that went on some of the tracks on the album. So important to have because it's going to be part of what you need as your construction kit if you want to get deep into recreating every song. So it's a different sound. We're going to quickly play you the Blackened one again so you can hear the difference here. It's really kind of all the mid-range is gone from that sound, and that's a combination of the built-in EQ on the amp that is being used to pull the mid-range out, the normal amp EQ pulling it out from the signal going in as well. It's a pre-EQ on that amp, so sort of pre and post removing mid-range from the sound, and then a massive amount of additional mid-cut going on in the EQ later as well. Dyers Eve is not so it's a bit more mid-rich, and you can hear it. So quickly contrast that again and you'll hear what I mean. It's very different. So A-B these. So a lot of mid-range.
Yeah.
So useful counterpoint. And if there's parts in a track where maybe they want to emphasize a riff or as a guitar playing on its own, it's quite likely that they would have had the contrasting sound do that so that it kind of, isn't always the same. So is the sound used on Dyers Eve? Definitely. Probably also a sound used as components on other tracks to build up combinations of these three. Eye of the Beholder is the Mesa Boogie again. Same amp as used for Blackened, but sounds, to my ear anyway, like they've disengaged the EQ on the amp that's doing the mid cut. It's got the same core feel to it, but again, we'll do the A-B. It's kind of useful to hear. So that's the Blackened one with the mid scoop. Eye of the Beholder. Yeah, different sound again. Changes the feel of the track as well because it's got a much, again, more mid-focused sound.
You definitely get the production values coming through when
you're feeling and I think it's to do with the riffs as well. When he's writing the riffs, some of them are faster than others for a start, and in that case, maybe you want to hear a bit more detail in the notes.
Yeah.
Some of them you just want them to be super heavy, and in that case, it's all about the low end and that kind of the sucking the middle part of the frequency range out of the sound can give the kind of perception of size.
Yeah.
Massive low. It's like the loudness button on the old stereos. Remember that?
Yeah,
That's exactly what it did. Turn up the bass and the treble. But it's kind of
shake.
Yeah. I mean, this kind of thing to make it sound a little bigger and heavier and stuff. But it doesn't work very well when you're doing really fast, intricate stuff because it's just going to be a mess. You're not going to hear it. And equally, it's kind of another third part to this, overall toolkit that they have on this album. Again, listen to the Blackened as a reference, and then this version of what is effectively the same amp. You can hear they're the same amp.
Yeah.
But the way that it's been treated is different, and the way it ends up on the song obviously is different too. The Dyers Eve one, on the other hand, is clearly a different source, different amp. So
the positioning as well seems different in the mix.
And having those as a setup is really great, because if you think you're writing riffs and you're doing things in the way Metallica do, where they often have breaks and a guitar will play a riff on its own to introduce it, and then the band will come in around it. Having those little flavors of different versions of sounds that you can use to enhance that part, make it sound smaller just for a minute, and then wham, it comes in with the big combination of layered sounds. So it's a useful tool in kind of shaping the sound of the song.
You kind of get if you look at this and the building blocks that you've got, that's what you're getting from the pack as well, right? So you've got these sounds, the ability to adapt it quickly. You've got the same tools as they had, really, to evolve your own sound.
And that's the idea. So that's, again,
metal. You can have your little flavour on it, right?
You get the kind of construction kit in a way, right? For the core sounds that were going on. So I've got an example. I'm going to do this now.
Yeah.
I've got an example here of the layering that I was talking about. And this is what I'm going to do is quickly play on its own, and then I'll bring in a backing track which has no guitar on it. So I've got this backing track obtained from the marvelous YouTube.
It would be death of the dead. Tomorrow Blackened.
It has no guitars.
It's so weird.
Sounds pretty strange.
It's so weird hearing it like that.
And for those of you familiar, this will really flesh out, I think, this will clear up the picture of the difference between what it sounds like to play one of these sounds once on your own versus what you're hearing on the album. And, maybe this is a technique that you can use for making your own tracks, especially if you're into this heavier style. It's something I wouldn't say necessarily that Metallica invented, but certainly they popularized it, and it became almost kind of like normal for heavy recorded rhythm parts. After that, I'll explain exactly how I've got this working at the moment, and you'll be able to recreate the idea if you want to. So here's a bit of this part of the playing, and it's right. So this is one guitar playing one version of this riff. I said the riff itself is the same actually, but it's the way that it's been split is that one of the guitars first plays on its own, and that is panned to one side of the mix on the left-hand side, and then another one comes in as the song progresses. So what appears to be the two separate sections here are actually composite layers of playing the same thing again and again, which James Hetfield is an absolute
badass
master of.
Yeah.
He's like a robot, right? He can play the same part twice to the point where you can't hear any difference at all, and even to where it can sound almost like chorus.
Yeah,
it's just so close.
Yeah.
Now I'm not claiming to be anywhere near that good, but I can do enough of that to demonstrate the principle of the idea. So here is just one guitar playing the left-hand side riff. There we go. Right. So apologies again if it's not exactly correct. I do my best, but the memory's foggy after 40 years or whatever it is. Not quite that many. So here's the right-hand side. So the right-hand side doesn't start until a fair way in. It starts with this kind of chord, plays this chord, and then it just hangs around for a bit, lets the left-hand side set the scene, and then after quite a while, it comes in with like a... There we go. And then joins in on the riff. So those two things are what make up this scene, and everything else that's going on around that are doubles of those two things. They're identical performances of exactly the same thing on the left and the right, and they are panned between
filling
the left and the
size.
right to varying degrees. So I've labeled them in here so I can tell you what they are. They're also not all the same volume in the mix. So there's a kind of a lead sound that is the one you hear the most.
Lead left.
and then there are others that will be blended. So this one is 8 decibels quieter, for example, and this one quieter again. You can see on the screen, I'm sure, if you zoom in, if you want to know the exact numbers, this is exactly how everything is set.
So you're getting quite a lot of detail about the packs.
Yeah, I mean, if you wanted to recreate this technique,
Yeah.
I mean, this is what I'm hearing.
Yeah.
And, you know, I've been a producer for a long time and I've heard my share of recorded guitars. Maybe there are some more quiet parts. Bear in mind, a lot of it is to do with how tightly it's tracked and how well you match the double and the triple and the quadruple, however many times you're going to do it. That's kind of the most important part, is you don't want it messy. It's got to be clean. It's got to be the same. And you're about to find out how badly mine is not. But you'll hear the sound at least. Basically now we're going to demonstrate the full sound of all these different parts running together. As I said earlier on, if you want to know exactly how they're panned and the differences in the level of each track, it is right here on the screen for you. It's all labelled up. It's everything between this green dot and this yellow dot. The top one is just a group track that they're all playing through so that I've got a master mute. But these individual ones here are labelled as how they are panned, and their volumes are visible here as well. I'm sorry about the grey on grey. Hopefully you can read it.
Love grey.
Yeah. So so this is what it sounds like all together, like all of those tracks at the same time, and you'll hear. What I'll do, let me play you a little bit of it, and then I'll play it with the backing track so you can hear how it sounds. Right, there you go. You can hear it's not perfect. There are little things poking out there, but it doesn't matter. For the purpose of a demonstration, you'll get the idea. So now I'm playing with the actual backing track, and hopefully you'll see that there's some familiarity to the sound. Certainly if you know this record, you'll know this sound.
Blackened!
There we go. Right, we've already lost copyright on this video. Yeah. Never mind. So,
our pleasure.
But I think, look, it's important for us to demonstrate that so that you can see how the context matters.
Yeah.
Recording and presenting the sounds in a similar way is going to give you a much more authentic version of how it sounds. Interesting to me as well, how much heavier and how much the sounds, they sort of feel like they have much more gain when you start adding them together.
Has a very heavy sound.
It has a heavy sound, and it's because it's like really
pulling you.
It's accentuating all of the extremes that are in that sound. And yeah, I mean, if we go back to the actual dry sound, it doesn't sound as huge on its own, but also it sounds maybe a little bit less driven. Like
kind of.
And that may be just the combination of, you know, all of the differences, minute differences that just make it fill in blanks to make it sound like it's got more gain. I don't know, but that's the overall feel. So there we go. That's a little lesson in layering for you. Hopefully it was good enough for you to get the idea. So one other sound that we couldn't really ignore on this album is from what's arguably the biggest hit, which is One. And it had a clean guitar intro. And Metallica are kind of known for having this contrast between sort of super clean guitar parts, even sometimes in the older albums, like acoustic guitar parts, and the super heavy. So this one was interesting to recreate because I think it's kind of a compounded mix of a few different things, and it has some characteristics about it that are not just anything like any single amp. So recreating it was actually quite fun. It was a bit of a challenge, but hopefully you'll be able to recognize it. So this part from the beginning. Oh. Rubbish, sorry. And my younger self is hating me for not playing that properly. Sorry. There was a time.
It was deliberately put in.
There was a time. But you get the idea. So it's that quite a distinctive sound. Main component of it is a Roland Jazz chorus. There's actually a little bit of clean ADA MP1 blended to that as well. And some extra kind of more studio-based enhancing of the top end through various different outboard devices to give it that kind of almost sparkly, particularly when he pulls that, the G. It's got a very bell-like quality to it. So as you can hear, it's turned out pretty well. So that sound is there, and this is the first so far that we've come across that also has a effect preset. So important really for the sound. If I turn it off, then you'll hear a very different experience.
It's hiding over here. Where have you gone?
I mean, it's the same sound, but the effects have a big part to play here. Particularly the heavy chorus that comes from the Roland JC120, which has a distinctive sound. Luckily, the modulation we have available in Convology really perfectly nails that. And it's great because so far we've used this plugin an awful lot to deliver the presets for these packs, and not yet has it disappointed us in terms of what it can do. Obviously, for the main reverb element, we've matched the type of reverb that was on the original, and we're able to deliver that as a convolution reverb, so it's super authentic. As you can hear, it's not like the loudest reverb in the world, but it's definitely audible. So there we go. So you get all of the effects as well to give you the final sound that I'm sure, if you're a fan of this album, you will recognize. Same sound used for the rhythm and the lead parts. I'm not 100% sure that it was the same guitar, though.
Maybe it's a different guitar.
It's similar. I think maybe Kirk's part. Well, it definitely wouldn't have been Explorer. By same guitar, I mean like the same EMGs and because I know he was playing a lot of different stuff at that time. In the video, he's playing an ESP Strat. It's definitely not a Strat. It's definitely a humbucker that he's using for the lead part, but hard to say for sure. But experiment with that to find the closest match you can. The tone, though, is exactly the same sound. So there we go, an effect preset, and not the last. So we're going to do now just a little bit of explaining around the idea that these sounds, yes, they are very specific to a specific song on a specific album, but knowing what we were discussing earlier about the commonality of some sounds being reused multiple times, being used on different songs, being slightly different, but maybe the same core with a different EQ, but not wildly different. I just want to show you one of those examples here. So while we're on this song, I've taken the core tone from Blackened, the profile as it is, slightly changed the EQ, and I'll show you how that sounds different to the original settings.
Magic.
Let me just go here. Wrong one, sorry, it's this one. just check that was what I showed you. I think it was. Yeah, it was. Yeah. So this is the original presentation of this profile. And just slightly tweaked using only the EQ in Neural Amp Modeler. Similar but different. You can see, I've said this already on other videos, I'll say it again here. Do not be afraid to use the EQ on Neural Amp Modeler. It's super useful. You just want to do a slight alteration, a correction, or in this case, we're just trying to make it sound more like the tone on a different song, but it's the same core sound. In my experience, any more than about 3 decibels in either direction is a bit extreme, but any less than that sounds really natural. This EQ is not like an amp EQ. It's not pretending to be or trying to be. It's much more like a studio equalizer. It's dividing the frequency spectrum into 3, bass, middle, and treble, like a guitar amp would, but you can use this more like you would a studio EQ and just use it to maybe move the sound slightly more towards, a slope, even by doing, say, +6 on the treble, 5 in the middle, and 4 on the bass. Just create like a slope that will make the sound just a bit brighter, or in the other direction if you wanted to make it rounder. And it's really nice. Actually, it really works well. So don't be afraid to use it. Same with the input control. Again, I'll repeat. I've seen people talking about how this tries to guess changes to the gain and all this kind of. It doesn't do any of that. It is literally just a volume control for the signal going in. So it's really perfectly safe to use. It's not going to change the sound. It's just going to give you less gain or make your guitar quieter effectively, and no different to that. And the same for the output. The normalize you should always enable, because when we create the presets, we try to make sure they contain the correct normalized calibration number. What that means is there'll be similar volumes. When you profile stuff, sometimes it can end up with a file that, if you don't have the normalize enabled, could be a wildly different volume to another profile, which is not a problem if you're mixing it, but if you're switching between them and stuff, it can be annoying. So if you turn normalize on the plugin, it will kind of correct all that for you. It's quite nice. Anyway, I digress. Back to what we were talking about. So we've got the sort of one-ified version of the Blackened sound. You can hear they're not wildly different, but significantly different, just using the EQ.
Nice.
And this is that sound. Etc. So just an example of how you can take any of these profiles, and as long as they're the right rig and close enough, you can then just use the EQ, even just on NAMM, to shift them towards another track. So don't be thinking that just because it says Blackened on the profile, that's the only thing it's good for. These are authentic recreations, and in just the same way as they could be sounds that were reused for different purposes during the process of creating this album, you could do exactly the same thing backwards almost and recreate other pieces of the album using the core tones that they used to build it in the first place. So so that's that. We're going to do a little bit now of television magic, because I need to swap guitars.
It's going to be magic
For the next demonstration. So
that's a great guitar.
So we can't really do the lead tone without switching onto the Randy Rhoads. Now, obviously, Kirk Hammett has a lot of guitars, and even back then had quite a variety. But there was one that I'd noticed that he kept going back to a lot, right the way from Master of Puppets until even right now to this day. I've seen him on the last tour, pictures of him playing his Randy Rhoads, which is it's a fixed bridge version. It has no tremolo, but it's clearly a favorite of his, and I love him as well. But this is kind of a guess. I'm not sure that it is a guitar that he would have played. Probably really uncomfortable to sit around a studio making an album with. So maybe not, but at least I'll romanticize that.
Yeah.
idea that it was the cool
He
guitar.
was definitely
that he
there,
used
smoking a cigar.
for the most iconic solo on the album. And by no means am I going to attempt to remember it all right now. There is a demo that I did actually sit down and work out this solo and play it on the website. There's a demo with this sound, but I'll play a bit of it for you at least now. So again, we've got an effects preset to go with this one because it has effects, reverb mainly. And you're going to want this on if you want the full album mixed sound experience. Again, there's a video on how to set these presets up, how to install them. There's a link down below to that video. Go watch it if you want to know how to do it. It's very easy, but a separate topic to this. So back to our main sound. This guitar seems to match it perfectly. So I didn't have to change anything at all. And hopefully you'll get the idea, or I'll try not to make a mess of it. There we go. Right. The solo. So this is a sound that is reused a lot. I think it might be the sound he uses for all of the lead stuff on this album, maybe with only a couple of exceptions. And in the notes, it says that they blended together the ADA MP1 with the sound of a Mesa Boogie, but I can't hear it.
Yeah.
Certainly, if there is a blend, it's very, very subtle.
Yeah.
Maybe that's just... And I've seen Kirk Hammett say that in interviews as well. And I don't know if maybe he means they recorded both.
Yeah.
But certainly when you hear the sound of the lead work on this album, all of it sounds like the MP1. It's quite a distinctive sound.
Yeah.
So we didn't really find that it was as much value doing multiple, lead sounds as it was getting the full toolkit for the rhythm sounds and obviously the clean one. So that's why there's only really one lead sound needed here, which is cool. What's interesting though about the ADA MP1 sound is when he uses it, he put a tube screamer in front of it, which does change it quite a lot from the basic sound of the unit. As you know, a tube screamer tends to really focus the mid-range. Makes it great for lead playing because it's going to cut through a mix, and obviously fits very well with mid-scooped rhythm guitars. You've got a very mid-focused lead sound that's got a little place there to sit and be heard. But equally, as we were showing just now, by taking one of the other profiles and repurposing it for a different part of a different song, this sound, if you take away the effects, the studio effects, and turn down the input gain, so it's feeding less signal in, can also become a very nice... And I would be surprised if that sound isn't somewhere on the album. You can definitely hear the tube screamer. It's got that kind of like vowel-like vocal mid-range. When you take it away and go back to, and this is a different amp, bear in mind. Well, actually, no, Dyers Eve is an ADA, so there we go. Why don't we go to that? That, you can clearly hear the... It's a bit more kind of, I don't know, classic rock, maybe you'd say, more than
it's
metal.
getting closer.
Or even maybe a bit more like their older sound from previous albums. Not Master of Puppets, but like really old. So there we go. So that is not a sound that I found on the album, but it is just me showing you that, taking the sound used for that solo, dropping down the gain and taking the effects off of it, you've got another complete kind of core tone there. Which is quite cool. It's heavy. Very thick sounding. And that concludes really the chord sounds that we've got in here. So bear in mind that you can go and do your own research and try and match these sounds up to different parts on different songs. It's not required to be, spelled out. I don't think that would spoil all the fun. But you've got plenty of building blocks here to certainly go and start recreating any part of this album that you want. And even if it's just to play along with the record and, you know, have the same sound, it's much more immersive as an experience. For me personally, it was really fun to kind of realize finally the dream of being able to play the things that I was learning when I was younger through the exact sound that was on the record. I think there's a part of every guitar player that would love to do that, you know, play through the artist rig, you know, and it's probably the reason why we buy most of the equipment that we do, you know, throughout our careers as players, is, you know, you're inspired by a player, a sound, a particular thing that you hear on a record, and then you find out what that equipment was. And you're like, oh man, you know, I must buy that amp or you know, rack thing or whatever it is, and you plug it in, and you're like, oh, it's not quite it. It's not quite. I mean, you can tell maybe it's part of it, but it's not quite the full thing. So to be able to present that complete recreation of the sound that's on the record and be able to play it in real time as well, it's kind of a dream come true for me, and I'm hoping that it'll bring joy to a lot of you out there when you get a chance to play this, and obviously the others that we're going to be doing soon. So that kind of brings me on to another point here, which is that, you know, we've done this album, we've already got another kind of diametrically opposed pack out there, which is the John Mayer Continuum one. We wanted to try and start with maybe polar opposites to cover as many different players as we could. There's some very important middle ground coming next. And obviously we're planning to do a load of these. Please leave your comments in the discussion below, and let's talk about maybe what you guys would love to see as one of these packs. Let us know what you think of the video and the idea and anything else that comes to mind. I'd be really excited to see what some of you do with these sounds. You know, there's already loads of people who are, you know, making cover videos and all kinds of other fun stuff to do with Metallica. So putting these out there, we're really hoping to see some of you be able to have some fun with them, and look forward to seeing what you come up with when you use them.
Yeah. And don't just think of these as sounds. Everyone's had that experience when you connect with it a bit. So like if you've never picked up a guitar and you're just about to start, this is going to make that so much more rewarding, because it's like when you hit and you resonate and that hits you, that memory, that makes everything that much more enjoyable. And you're also, as a beginner, there's a bit more sympathy. There's a bit more sympathy in there.
Well, yeah, there's also the other part of it, which is now that the sound is no longer an excuse.
Yeah, well, it can't be.
That's it. But that's positive, because, you know, you can spend a lot of time playing around with gear, thinking, oh, you need to get a better sound.
Yeah.
At least you know that this is kind of tested and tried. Like, it shouldn't be the problem. You can just get on with playing.
And if you're experienced, the only way I can summarize it is when you hit record and everything goes wrong, because there's all these other things going on in your mind, right? That really clears that stuff through. And we've got a few people, so some really established guitar players, especially the guys working with in Austria, and they're taking those John Mayer tones and the bass, they're cutting new songs in a day with the subtle adaptations that we've got from the things as well. And
why not? Exactly. Yeah. Right. So, I mean, you might look at that and think, oh, you can't use another artist's sound.
Yes, you can.
Oh, come on.
Come on, that's where it will come from.
Where do you think John Mayer,
get
the idea for his sound? The fact that he had to go out and buy all of the equipment that was used by the people that he liked, and literally, when I say all of it, I mean a frightening amount of money was spent on reassembling a rig that would get close to the sound of his idols in order for him to take that and then make it his own. You know, that starting point, it's important, because I'm sure for him it was a feeling of security knowing he was starting from a known good point. And these are iconic sounds, and the process through which they are created or were created is not a common one today. It's, you know, the world has changed. There aren't huge budgets to make albums and lots of time to experiment. And so being able to draw on this type of sound for the creative process, I think is an extremely valuable thing. And I don't want them to be relegated to history. There's if you think about the build up to the point in time where music was extremely important to most people, the amount of money being spent on creating these projects, the amount of attention being paid to minute details in the creation of those sounds, experimentation, and years of playing live and building upon layer upon layer to get to a point where a band is like, oh, I've really nailed what I want now.
Yeah, testing against the audience
And that becoming an iconic thing that's identifiable. Those are things that you can stand on the shoulders of. Definitely. There's no different to enjoying the playing of somebody and learning how they played and then, making that your own, than enjoying a sound and doing the same thing. I think it's really difficult to do if you don't have access to it. So of course that's prohibitive, but hopefully what we're doing here is going to really change that, because it gives you access to, the familiar sound. Like there's no kind of, I know that's the amp he used. I know that's the pedal he used. So I'm going to buy that amp and I'm going to buy that pedal. This is kind of maybe decouples things a little bit from the individual pieces of equipment. The sound itself becomes an identity that you can interact with independently.
It's that sound, the production. I know production doesn't have a sound. It's not.
Well, it does.
But it's that thing. So
if you heard the sound of most raw amps that came into the studio when I started recording things back in the day, man, there was production needed, or it would have never ended up on the record.
What you experience is if you like with the John Mayer pack, you could be playing something totally different, and you experience this familiarity with something, and it's that production.
There's heritage in I mean, he's a good example because he really does wear his influences on his sleeve, and he puts all of that heritage into the sounds that he uses, and it's intentionally familiar but not the same. It's
then you have how the producer took his thing
and made it, and he's made it his own as well through
icing on the cake.
His personal taste has then influenced the final mixes and the recordings that he's making with those sounds, and those changes are making it unique and him. So I don't think that's ever been any different. Maybe it's not been scrutinized quite in that way, but the very idea that taking the sound of a player that you like and trying to achieve the same sound is in some way devaluing you as a player. It's always what's always been done. We tried. The difficulty back then was that we couldn't achieve that same sound. It was impossible. So what you end up with at the end is like just as far as you could get, and that'll do. But we're in a very different time now. Technology is allowing us to capture perfectly exactly what we have in front of us in the studio environment and present that as a profile that can be played in real time. And that's a really new thing, because although we've had amp profiling devices around for a long time, they aren't capable of this, and we've tried to do this with them, and without exception we were unable to get out what we put in with everything that we tried except for Neural Amp Modeler, which is why it's what we're using. There's really no point in doing this if the end result is not the start of that. It's not, we recreate the sound in the studio using all of the authentic stuff and then capture it and get something different at the end. What was the point in that process? It's like, we did it, trust us, if we did it.
We took ages to
sound the same.
We almost got to the summit of Everest.
That's it. And so, we've found something that can actually give us back what we're putting in. And so that's the reason why these packs are now being made, because it was really waiting for that to be possible. But also the reason why they're being made for Neural Amp Modeler specifically, it is the only one that we could get to do that. And I've said this I think before in another video, but it's important to understand that's not bashing on other products that are amp modelers and amp simulators. They do exactly what they're designed to do, and they simulate the amplifier. But back to kind of where we started this whole discussion, that the amplifier itself is only a very small part of what makes up these profiles. Obviously, we're asking a lot of a product designed to do this part, to please, can you also do all of these things? They're algorithmic devices designed for a job and optimized to expect only these things to be fed in. Neural Amp Modeler is open source, and it's a bit more, you can get under the hood and interact with it in different ways, feed it different information, and it will not be quite so confused by that. So we're very happy that that has come along because it's allowed us to do this. And I think the results speak for themselves. But yeah, we've seen a few people asking in other comments whether are we going to release these for other platforms, other profilers, and the answer to that is right now we can't.
We can't now.
They can't do it. So it's not our choice to make. Unfortunately, there's certainly no way that I would.
They need more length.
I wouldn't want to release a compromised version of these sounds. Their value for me really is in the fact that you can listen to that original song, and you can hear that it's the same. And if as soon as you deviate from that for any reason, even if it is just to try and give it to a wider audience, you devalue that. It has to be perfect, really, as far or as close as perfect as it could be made. It has to be the same as what we're feeding in. Not to say that that should be a problem, because Neural Amp Modeler is free. And that's nice. And the same for the convology that we're using to do the reverb and time-based effects and all that stuff, also free. So in terms of what you have to set up in order to play these sounds, you just need the host, a computer good enough to run a couple of VST plugins, PC, Mac, it works on either. So, not like having to go and buy a flagship guitar processor that's thousands
You
of
don't
dollars.
need $15,000 to get this out.
Well, that's it. So that is a bonus. It's not the reason why we're doing it on Neural Amp Model. The sound is the reason. And so that will remain until other potential solutions come along that can deliver the same result. But for now, we don't really believe that that's needed. We have this kind of fantastic free open source platform to work with, and it's really delivering everything that we need. So that's the long answer to why it's not on other things yet. Anything else?
No. I hope you enjoy it. And do chuck stuff in because we want to not just show you stuff, explain it as well.
Yeah, and of course, send us your videos, your creations using these sounds. Can't wait to see what happens when you get hold of them and the stuff that you get to make with them.
And that's us reporting from the bridge
in
Neutron 1. I'm Jack.
Until next time, I'm Stuart.
Au
Thank you
revoir.
for